Hello, and thank you for joining us for our broadcast on ethnic studies in elementary classrooms. My name is Michelle Herzog. I'm the History Social Science Coordinator for the Los Angeles County Office of Education, and I'm thrilled to have our guests with us today. We have Dr. Keith Barton from Indiana University, who's a professor there, and we have Rebecca Valbuena, a teacher, educator, and lecturer from Cal Poly Pomona. Thank you both for joining us today. So we'll start a little bit just with a quick overview on ethnic studies. As you know, in California, AB 101 put into law, was a bill introduced, signed into law by Governor Newsom that established ethnic studies as a graduation requirement for all seniors, beginning with the class of 2930. High schools across the state need to have something in place for this year 2025 to 26. So there's a lot of great work going on across the state to get ethnic studies into those high school curriculums. And there's some flexibility involved with AB 101 too. It can be a course based on the model curriculum already developed by the commission. It can be an existing ethnic studies course. It can be something that's integrated already into an existing course that already meets the A through G requirements by the UC California or Cal State University. Or it could be something totally developed from scratch as well, but has to be approved by a governing board. Like I said, a lot of energy, a lot of work going on in this. And as we know, a lot of us don't want to see us waiting till high school to introduce ethnic studies as a topic. So today we're going to talk about why it's important, why we need to start introducing these themes and ideas with our youngest students in elementary schools. So my first question is to Keith. Why do you think it's important, Keith, tell us, to start introducing this at the elementary grades?
So if ethnic studies is important to teach, it's important to start early. We start reading and writing and math from an early age, so why wouldn't we start ethnic studies? But it's also important to keep in mind that the way we teach ethnic studies to younger children may be different than the way we teach it in high school. Certainly we want to make sure that students are exposed to the wide variety of different groups and their unique experiences and perspectives that have always been part of the country. So we want to make sure that that's included even in elementary schools. It's also important that students from a young age appreciate the similarities and differences in the experiences and achievements of different groups, because that's a foundation for civic life. In the United States, we have to live together with people who are different than ourselves, and students need to understand that from an early age.
So, Rebecca, you're a very experienced, outstanding elementary teacher, spent many years in elementary classrooms. From your point of view, why do you think it's important for our youngest students to be introduced to ethnic studies?
Well, young students are naturally curious. And so I think it's very important that we as teachers cultivate that curiosity. And what better way to do that than to look at people that are different from ourselves, as Keith mentioned, but also it provides students an opportunity to see themselves and feel a connection to the school. There's no reason not to include it.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great opportunity to start having those conversations. Keith, what does it mean? What does it look like at the elementary level? It's going to look and feel very different than high school.
That's right. Oftentimes when we're teaching topics like ethnic studies at the high school level, we're going to focus a lot on things like political systems, economic structures, and so on. And that's not always meaningful for elementary students. It's particularly not a good starting point for elementary students. So when we're teaching ethnic studies to younger kids, we want to focus on people and their lives, and to approach that in a way that students understand. So another thing we want to keep in mind with elementary school is we're not trying to cover the experiences of every ethnic group. I mean, that's just not a way to approach the elementary curriculum. Instead, we want to make sure that we're incorporating ethnic diversity into the content that we're already teaching in the elementary school.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. This idea of coverage is huge. It can take over the entire school year.
Right.
We face that in elementary, but then all the way up through high school too, right? That's the challenge for many of our teachers. Obviously, I agree, these are great goals. Rebecca, as a classroom, this idea of content and coverage presents some real challenges for elementary students. Our elementary teachers have to cover all the subjects, right? Even though we focus on social studies, they got to do it all.
Right.
And they have to present all that to students. It's that we have the conversation, are we layering more and more onto these teachers' plates for students? How do we deal with so much content and that being such a challenge?
I think the answer has to be an integration. So we want to be sure to integrate ethnic studies into perhaps what teachers are already doing in terms of using literature and embedding it into English language arts and their current social studies curriculum. So it's not necessarily an add-on, but just an intentional embedding of some ideas and concepts.
Yeah, and being really focused on use of time and materials, being really strategic.
Right,
I think so. That
intentionality.
feels natural.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I agree. So a lot of the work that you both focus on is using, and you mentioned this already, using children's literature. So why children's literature? Let's start with you, Keith. Why is that so powerful?
Well, there are just so many advantages to children's literature. I mean, for one thing, it presents information in a way that's much more understandable for students, particularly when it's in the form of stories. This is a natural way of understanding the world, and so it's a good starting point for younger kids. Also, one of the advantages of using children's literature is that if you use more than one book, it becomes very easy to incorporate multiple perspectives. So through a book set, you can have more complex, more complete, and comprehensive perspectives than you might have in just some other kind of reading that's going to focus on just one perspective. Another really important advantage of children's literature is that it tends to focus on what we can refer to as agency. That is, the choices that people make. And that's one of the main things we want students to learn throughout social studies. What choices do people make and why? And nearly every story is about that. And then one final thing is these days you can find children's literature on just about any topic with members of just about any ethnic group. So there's such a wealth of resources out there. Children's literature is just a natural go-to for teaching ethnic studies.
Yes, so much more out there than even 10 years ago, and
Yeah.
all the time, right?
Right.
Your libraries get bigger and bigger all the time.
Right.
So yeah, good point on that as well. And they're used to literature,
Yes.
hopefully, most young children. They're had stories read to them. It just becomes a natural part
Yeah.
of the classroom experience. So again, with so much out there, so much available, how do we bring focus to how teachers use the books and
Yeah.
what books they select?
Yeah, I mean, this is really key for the elementary curriculum because, again, there's so much to cover. You can't just try to cover it randomly. You want to focus. You want to have something that brings it all together. So teachers need to select a theme that has some meaning and significance, something that will make sense to students, but that will also have importance for the society at large.
Yeah.
There are a lot of different themes that elementary teachers could select. I particularly like this one based on a quotation from Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He said that life's most urgent and persistent question is, what are you doing for others? I mean, that's a very important civic question, and it's one that is understandable to young kids and that can really form a good foundation for teaching ethnic studies and social studies more generally.
We see this theme also across the ethnic studies model curriculum for high school, understanding of others, using voice, respect, tolerance, all of these things are really highlighted. Bringing that all the way down to elementary is powerful. And we all know when we do something to help others, we feel better about ourselves.
Yes, right.
And there's a lot of talk about social emotional well-being. What a great way to launch into that and address those issues as well.
I think one of the things we want to do in teaching that is to help students understand the wide range of ways that people can do things for others. Of course, they know how to be nice to their classmates, but we want them to think about all the other ways people do things for others, whether it's by making good consumer choices that are good for producers, or doing things that directly aid people in need, or even engaging in protests. All of these are ways of doing things for other people. And we also want them to think about what things can they do now as a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, and what kinds of things will they be doing when they're older, when they're teenagers, when they're adults. So it provides a focus, but it also expands their understanding of what it means to do things for other people.
Yeah, I think anyone who's been a parent or worked with young children or teenagers, there's very much a me-centered feeling among young people, right? So helping others, developing empathy, understanding, respect, comes out when we show examples, and then give kids the opportunities to act on that as well. We all know that too, so that's an important piece. So again, the theme of helping others, let's talk some more how that connects to ethnic studies.
Right. That's a good question. And I think that one of the important things to keep in mind is that students need to see that people of all different ethnicities have worked to make the world a better place. Both people like the students themselves and people who are different. So by focusing on this theme, but including a wide range of diversity, they can see how all people have contributed to making the world a better place.
Right. And you see across different lines, different demographics coming together in civil rights movements, all kinds of events, social justice movements. That's a good example to show them, and that comes out in children's literature as well.
That's right. And one of the things that also happens when they study different ethnic groups making the world a better place is they're exposed to some of those more complex topics that they'll cover in high school, because oftentimes the reason the world needs to be a better place is because of problems that stem from injustices, including injustices toward ethnic minorities. So it takes complicated ideas but puts it in a more understandable format for children.
Keith is spot on with that idea of the importance of ethnic studies and the importance of literature. And the reason we want ethnic studies to be used is that it's not learning about groups of people, but actually learning from groups of people. So that intentional use of books that we were talking about earlier and selecting of books is we're telling stories from the perspective of different ethnic groups, telling their stories, how they've contributed, and not necessarily looking from the outside in with just straight up informational text, but in the form of nonfiction narratives. And that's what makes it, I think, more powerful, is that storyline.
And we want to make sure that as we study different ethnic groups, we're not treating them like specimens under a microscope. We don't want to make them objects, but rather subjects that we can all learn from.
There's a lot of talk in ethnic studies about identity, your own personal identity, understanding that, the intersectionality of other identities, but then the identities of others. And so I think that comes out a lot when we're very selective about the types of books and stories that we're exposing kids to, right? What do you think? Okay, so I'd like to show an example. You both came and did a training for us here at LACO, and in the training you used the children's book, Pies from Nowhere. And I'd like to show a short video clip to show you how Dr. Barton introduces this book to students. Just the cover of the book. It's fascinating.
You see a bus in the background. Any sense of what time period it might be? I mean, does it look like it's recent or a little bit further ago? Yeah, cap, maybe the style of the bus looks a little bit older. What's the ethnicity of the woman? She's black. Black, it's older, and there's a bus. Does that alert you to any topics that are like really common in the elementary school curriculum? Yeah, the full title is How Georgia Gilmore Sustained the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Now, of course, it's very common to teach about the Montgomery bus boycott in elementary and secondary school. Typically, it will focus on Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks. My guess is you haven't heard about Georgia Gilmore, although she's actually extremely well known in the civil rights community. So now that you know the subtitle here, How She Sustained the Montgomery Bus Boycott, does that give you any insight into what the book might be about? Maybe again, just with a partner real quickly, speculate on what you think that means.
I love how you present that, Keith. It's just wonderful. As we saw in the video, you're setting the stage for students around the historical content, making predictions, what they think the book is going to be about, and then always connecting to their personal lives. So, no, Rebecca, I know you've used this technique many, many times. It's a little bit different than how in the past, the traditional way of introducing a book. So explain the difference.
Yeah, you definitely see Keith activate background knowledge in that little segment. And we all do that when we're introducing a book. asking predictions and getting students ready to read and excited to read. And I think the part that is a little bit more pointed and more intentional is the fact that he asked specifically about when does this take place and how do you know? And then asking the questions that are very pertinent to the topic and getting them to really focus in on what she might be doing to help others.
Yeah, I love the example. You know, those of us in social studies land have been arguing for many years to bring more of that into the elementary classroom. We understand and respect the need to emphasize reading and math and science. What a great way to integrate history and bringing it fast forward to students and what they can learn from that. So that's what I love about this kind of example and the opportunity for using all this literature. So we saw the introduction to the book. Keith, tell us a little bit, just basically in your mind, what is the book about? Tell our viewers.
So you
what the
can
book is
see
about.
that it's from the subtitle, it's how Georgia Gilmore sustained the Montgomery bus boycott. So it's about a girl, she grows up in Alabama and goes on to become a cook at a lunch counter, and of course lunch counters were segregated at the time. You can see that here. And she becomes aware of the fact that Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus, and so she finds out about the bus boycott, talks about how flyers were distributed, she learns about this. Then she goes to hear Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. give a speech, and she decides that she wants to become involved in the boycott, but she's not a well-known person, she's not a public speaker. She decides that how she can contribute is by baking food and selling it, and she gets other women together to do the same thing, so that they're baking pies and lunches and selling them all around the city to raise money for the bus boycott. And they raise quite a bit of money. They raised money for gas for the carpools and even raised enough money to buy cars. Later, she testifies in support of the boycott, and of course, she's fired. And so after that, Martin Luther King suggests she start her own restaurant in her home. And her restaurant became a meeting place for people of different races, both everyday people, but also the leaders of the bus boycott met there. And so the book ends with the boycotters being successful and with Georgia Gilmore realizing that there's still more work to be done. It's interesting that within the civil rights community, she's a well-known figure. She's not somebody we usually teach about in elementary school, but it's a great example. This would probably not be the first book you would use to teach about the Montgomery bus boycott, but after you've talked about King and Parks, this is a great way to show how other people can contribute in other ways.
I love the power of that. You won't see her name in the textbooks probably, like you said, but she's one of those unsung heroes. And I love the message that comes across. You don't have to be the brave Martin Luther King who's going to stand in front of thousands. You can help in small ways. That's the empowering message I think we want for young children too, right? There's little things you can do to be a contributor to help in all of the movements and things you want to see moving forward. So I think that lowers some of the tension, I guess, stress to, oh, well, you got to run for public office, you got to stand in front of 500. There's little things kids can do.
I also think it shows students that it wasn't just Martin Luther King. I think a lot of times they come out of that unit of study or that lesson thinking he did this by himself. But this book really shows that it was an entire community that took a lot of time and energy and perseverance working together to make things better.
And when you drill down just on the civil rights movement, there are dozens of people working in front of the scenes, behind the scenes. We're very excited to see the story of Bayard Rustin come out, who was African American, he was gay, and he organized the entire March on Washington. He's just now appearing in the storyline and the telling of the civil rights movement.
And there's at least one children's book about him.
Oh, there is? I
Yes,
didn't know
yes.
that. I've seen 2 documentaries now. Bennett Singer has one that's fabulous, so that's great. All right, very exciting. Let's look at another example. This was another book you highlighted. We don't have time to show them all, but this one was called My Two Border Towns. And so tell us a little bit what this was about.
This is a fictional book, but about a very real-world situation. And it's about a boy and his father who are on the U.S. side of the border, and they take a trip to Mexico to buy some things. And at the beginning of the story, they're just buying a few different things that you can imagine, like bringing back Mexican Coke and some prescriptions and so on. But as the story goes on, you realize that their reason for going across the border is a bit more complicated and has to do with doing things for other people.
So you said Mexican Coke, Coca-Cola.
Yes, Coca-Cola.
Okay, yeah, just wanted to clarify that. All right, so yeah, it's a lovely story. So we're going to watch another video clip to see how Keith reads the story aloud. Now, we're not watching this just to hear the story, but I want you to pay attention to the types of guiding questions that he intersperses as he's reading the story, very pointedly, very intentionally. So let's take a minute and watch that.
Every other Saturday, my dad wakes me up early. Come on, Mio, he says. Vamos a otro lado. The other side's not so far away, just down the road, right past my school. Mama gives us a kiss and a list. It's different every time we go. Let me just stop there. What do you think the list is? Shopping list? What do you think they would be shopping for? What do you think they might be shopping for? Market. Keeping in mind the title of the book and what you already know from the cover.
They're going to be buying things that you can only get maybe in Mexico.
Could be, could be. And then on this page it says, I grab my special bag, hold it tight as I follow Dad, thinking of what's inside for my friends. So be thinking about, well, what does his friends have to do with this? As we drive through town, we pass my favorite spots. Neighbors line up early for Daisy's yummy pastries. At a stoplight, Dad calls to the newspaper man, holding out $1. Aquí tiene, don Memo. Thanks. Now, at this point on those pages, it's interesting to go through with when I'm talking to teachers in Indiana about the combination of English and Spanish on all the different signs and so on. But then also with anybody these days, I have to explain what a newspaper is. It's like actually printed. And, okay. Before I know it, we reach the broad river, a watery serpent that glints with the dawn. Dad reminds me, Coelticans once lived here. Before all this was Mexico, both riverbanks. Now we're two countries. We paid across. Morning, says the U.S. Customs Guard, taking Dad's cash with a sleepy frown. On the other bank, the great eagle greets us. Dad waves at the soldiers and they tip their caps. No one searches through my bag this time. I say thanks to the Virgin. So, with my students, I always talk about, okay, what's the eagle? What's that all about? In Indiana, they don't immediately recognize that as being a Mexican national symbol or part of the flag. They may not know what it means. Some of them will know what it means to say thanks to the Virgin, but there's a lot to cover on those couple of pages to establish the context. We drive up the narrow main street till Don Chava flags us down and helps us park. He and my dad shake hands. Le cuido la troca, he says with a smile. You and your boy have fun. This town's a twin of the one where I live, with Spanish spoken everywhere just the same, but English mostly missing till it pops up like grains of sugar on a chili pepper. And with kids, it's good. You can spend some time here talking about what are the different activities you see going on these pages. All the way home, I imagine a wonderful day when all my friends from the other side can go back and forth between my two border towns, just like me. So take a few minutes at your table to talk about what's your response to this book, and maybe also what similarities or differences do you see compared to Pies from Nowhere.
So another great example, obviously we've highlighted two different groups, but we know there's dozens more we can select from. We just want to show an example. So Rebecca, from a teacher's perspective, I know you clue right into the types of questions. You ask the same kinds of questions. What is Keith doing in asking the questions that he asks?
Yeah, so number one, I think having the questions planned ahead is extremely important. And so we see that he is asking text-to-self questions, text-to-text questions, text-to-world questions. And he's also asking the normal comprehension questions just to see if the audience is understanding the story or if your students are following along, asking them also to make predictions. throughout the story takes moments, like we call them teachable moments, to add information that students might need to, we've already tapped their background knowledge, but this is building on it so that they can comprehend the story and retain it when they can connect it to things they already know or the things that he's adding to the story. And then it's really important, like we always say, every few minutes to have the students interact so they can process. So the talk and turn or a quick write or doing something, these short interactive tasks throughout the reading of a story helps students make sense of it and comprehend it, retain it, and be able to process it in a little higher level.
There is one type of question that I advise people to avoid. It's tempting to ask students things like, how would you feel if you were in this situation or that situation? But the problem with that is that students are really not very good at articulating their feelings. And in particular, they can't actually imagine how they would feel if they were in totally different circumstances, members of a different ethnic group. And so what they're likely to do is to think about their own situation and imagine how they would respond in another circumstance. But that's really not what we're after. That minimizes the distinctiveness of other people's perspectives and experiences. So we want to focus on how did the people in this story or this setting think and feel, not how would you feel if you were there.
I'm really glad you brought that up because that's a very common thing where we go as teachers, like, well, how would you feel if you were so-and-so? And we have to be hypersensitive to, as much as we know our kids, we don't know what kind of traumas they might have gone through, or we don't want to reignite some of that reaction. We need that to be that safe, welcoming space. So I think that little bit of distance, like you mentioned, is really very helpful and important to think about.
And
too.
back to the points you made at the beginning, this is about learning about other people. So thinking about and empathizing and understanding other points of view is a point.
Well, and we know, we both work with young kids. When they want to share, they're going to share.
Yeah.
Probably more than you want to hear.
Right.
Let me tell you the time, and then, it's all you can do to reel that in. That's a different situation, but you don't want to create uncomfortableness.
Yeah, I think that's a very common text-to-self connection.
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up too. And I think these are good techniques even beyond, obviously, elementary school, right? Middle school, even more sensitive, more emotional, more triggers sometimes. Traditionally, if you went into an elementary classroom and looked at the library, you'd see a lot of fiction, right? But now we're talking about bringing in more nonfiction. And I know you've done that too, and that's very strategic and intentional, weaving in nonfiction about science, social studies, history, all these things. Give us a few examples of what you've done.
Sure. You can always find books about a topic, nonfiction and fiction. And I think the importance is to cluster these books together in a set. So perhaps instead of a classroom library lined up by reading level or however, or random, that they're in baskets or in sections by topic. And within that box or that space are fiction and nonfiction books on a topic of various levels. And I think it's important to remember that a narrative can be nonfiction. So it doesn't have to be an informational book that reads like a textbook.
Yes.
Those aren't always the most motivating to read.
Yes.
But for example, Pies from Nowhere is a true story, but it's written in a narrative. So those are the kinds of things I think are the most powerful, is looking for those nonfiction stories that are told in the narrative, complementing them with informational text and other resources, but really just kind of clustering your books by topic and letting kids explore. Kids know their own reading level. They know what they can read and what they can't read. I don't think it's always necessary for us to tell them what books they can read based on their level, but let them explore by interest. So a basket of books on a topic lets them dive into something they're interested in, whether it's the Montgomery bus boycott or marching or any of the topics that we've covered. You can find books anywhere. And we'll talk a little bit later about how to vet for those.
I like that a lot. So I'll tell you a little story. This is a personal story. It was President's Day recently, and my 7-year-old grandson, second grade, so I'm the one, of course, asking about the social studies. I want to know what he's learning. And do you know the presidents? And we started talking about Abraham Lincoln, and he started telling me about, yes, and Abraham Lincoln, tried to free the slaves, and Douglas was involved. And I'm thinking, Stephen Douglas? How does he know about Stephen Douglas? Douglas-Lincoln debates? No, Grandma. Of course I'm wrong, right? Frederick Douglass. I know all about him because I read the book. And someone else read about Lincoln, and someone else read it. It was a text set is what he was talking about. And the kids could self-select books. And he went through, he told me all about Frederick Douglass. Like second grade.
Yeah, self-selection's important.
Yeah, it was cool. Very cool. So I'm glad we're talking about the intentionality on the types of books to select for the best use of time, and then how to use them effectively, constructively. Can you drill down a little bit more, Rebecca, on some of the criteria you use in selecting books for your classroom?
Well, the first thing I do is look at reputable lists to see how they've been vetted instead of just Googling or looking on a search engine for
Thank
any
you.
book. So looking at the NCSS notable trade book list or any of the other reputable lists to start with. And then once I find a book that or a series of books that I think might be interesting, it's really important to focus on 4 criteria. And number 1, we want to read the book ahead of time, make sure that it's interesting for children. And a lot of times I like the main character to be a child, if possible. I think that's always extra motivating for kids to see stories in history or in contemporary life about children their own age, and that there's a problem to be solved and it's an interesting narrative. And I think that goes with any story. We also want to make sure that the language is engaging. And this is a chance for us as teachers to read above their independent reading level. We can expose them to really beautiful and interesting and powerful vocabulary that they might not be able to read independently, but can listen to and be exposed to. So I'm looking for that interesting language, varied sentence structure, lots of figurative language so they can really visualize the story and know the characters. You know those books where you read and you're like, I know that character, I want to be friends with that character at the end. So that kind of connection, that really rich writing. We want to make sure the interpretation is sound, that all perspectives are covered and that it's historically accurate. So a lot of times these books will have in the back how the author got their information, and I love to find those. And if they're not there, I'll research and make sure that the story has accuracy and includes multiple perspectives. And then obviously we want the illustrations to be beautiful because that's going to be what pulls kids in the first place and just makes a book that much more meaningful in terms of, am I understanding more of the story from the pictures? Are they interesting? Are they something I want to go back and look at? Or photos. It could be photos. I love primary source photos in there too, or a combination of both. So those kinds of things I think make a book really intriguing and are excellent and best choices for read-alouds and lesson design.
And I know if the teacher's excited about the book, it comes out in the telling of the story too, right? So the more animated you are in reading it, obviously it's more interesting too, and kids are just glued, right? I've also seen picture books, children's literature used at middle school and high school levels too. I wouldn't be shy away from that. They may balk, but they like it too. They
Children
like
of
it too.
all ages love being read to.
Yes.
Adults love being read to.
Yes, we do, don't we? Pictures or no pictures? Yeah. Oh, you're bringing back lots of good memories, for sure. All right, so we've selected a special book. We've read it. Let's talk about the important part. What happens next? We just put it aside and we're done? Ask a few comprehension questions? Because I love all the terminology you're using. It's all about literacy, too. This literacy is not segregated out from this whole exercise, is it? So talk about after the book.
Well, of course, after the book, we're going to be doing some sort of activity, and that activity is going to be about the book. We're extending the content of the story, the big ideas of the story through some sort of activity. And these activities that we want to use are very carefully planned and intentional. It's not, just draw a picture of your favorite scene or retell the story. We're looking for things deeper than that go into the theme of ethnic studies that we're after, that connect to the book, include some higher level thinking, and are just a really great space for us as teachers to know whether we've gotten our message across or the message of the story across.
So can you talk about a few examples and how to do this?
Sure. So with the Georgia Gilmore story, students could write a dialogue between Georgia Gilmore and one of the members of her club and explain the role of the club to new members. So they can write a dialogue back and forth. They might create a historical marker for Georgia Gilmore, and then in that way they would have to synthesize information and write up a little short marker for her. And then they can look up the real one and compare how her real historical marker looks to the one that they made. They might do something as simple as draw a picture of something that was important from the book and put a caption under it, and even write one sentence. And sometimes we like to use his magic words that are like using the word because or although, because using those words allow us to show cause and effect and go at a deeper level if they're just responding in even one sentence. So those are some of really simple and quick example activities that have to do with the book and push their thinking to a higher level.
So I remember my own experience as elementary teacher. Eve Bunting was a very popular author. She had a lot of social action themes. We would read stories about homeless children. Fly Away Home was a favorite. I don't know if it's still used or not. It was about a father and son who basically lived in an airport terminal and just moved from place to place. And we introduced it, we talked through it, and this was with young kids, and talked about the issue of homelessness. And it became a launch for a great service learning activity that followed. They visited a homeless shelter that was well organized. The kids organized a food drive. So here they are, I can help others in small ways by bringing a can of food to school, or toilet paper, or whatever it was that they needed. So yes, there's 1,000 million examples. And it doesn't have to take a lot of time.
Right.
It doesn't have to distract from all the other stuff that we're required and expected to cover in our work. So Keith, we heard Rebecca talk about some great activities that are interesting but also engaging. Are there other criteria you can share with us that make activities worthwhile?
I think in terms of 3 characteristics of an activity that really allow us to make sure that we get the most out of the activities. The first one is that the first activity you do after a book should be about the book. Sometimes there's a tendency to jump a little far ahead. So we've read a book about someone doing something in their community, and we ask students, how could you help in your community? That's an extension or a follow-up. That's a great activity, but the first thing you want to do is to have an activity that's just specifically about the content of the book. Because just reading a book to students doesn't mean they've understood it or understood it deeply. So part of the purpose of the activity is to make sure they really understand the content of that book before you move on to the follow-ups and extensions.
So checking for understanding, that's a basic comprehension. There might be some misunderstandings. You might have some students that are struggling with English, or maybe they're missing some things.
Right.
Maybe it's a pair share or something.
Right.
Make sure they're getting that. So
That's
I think
right.
that's a very good point, because sometimes to save time we want to jump ahead, but I
Right.
like that. Slow it down a little, make sure they understand it.
Another thing we want to make sure is that the activities are open-ended. That is, things where there's more than one right way of responding, but not where all responses are correct. In other words, these are not just opinion questions or activities where everything you say is right, because that doesn't necessarily help students understand the content, but rather things like the activities about the Georgia Gilmore book, where there's more than one way to do it, but you still have to draw on the information from that book in order to give meaningful responses.
And I'm assuming all of these ideas you're talking about run the gamut from very young, transitional kindergarten, all the way through, we're talking about elementary, 5th or 6th grade, but even beyond that.
And also, of course, within any one classroom, there's going to be a wide range of achievement levels. Making the assignment open-ended allows kids to enter it from wherever they are, instead of saying there's only one right way to do it.
Good point. We've got a lot of diversity,
Yeah.
big range of reading level,
Right.
all of that,
Right.
life experiences. The third criteria.
Well, you want to make sure that the activity involves high order thinking. It could be asking students to compare things or look for cause and effect, maybe to synthesize, putting things together into an overarching idea, or to make some kind of evaluation, making a judgment based on evidence, or making a decision or ranking. But we don't want students just reproducing what's in the book. We want them to do something higher level with that information.
Act on it. It's a great launch for a lot of things that can be done.
One kind of all-purpose approach that's very common is what's called the RAFS format for activities. You can do this with really almost any book. The RAF stands for role, audience, format, topic, and strong verb. Now, it sounds a little bit complicated, but if you look at the two activities here, it would be things like imagine you're a journalist writing an article about the boy and his father from my two border towns for readers of a local news site. So you see that has in it a role, the audience it's for, what they're doing, and so on. Or imagine you're a woman in the club from nowhere explaining in a talk to new members why they have to keep their work secret. So that's just like a general format that can be applied to almost any book in very creative ways, but that makes sure that students are doing something authentic related to the content of that book.
And so we're introducing writing. Let's not forget that. That's a very important skill, but they have a context now and purpose for doing that.
Right. A simpler version of RAFs is sometimes used in the primary grades where maybe you don't have the role in the audience, but just the format, the topic, and the strong verb, such as draw and caption a picture about an event in a book, or write a sentence with because about a book. So it's the same general idea, but is a little bit more adapted for younger kids.
And you've got some personal flexibility for kids, but within a structure.
Yes, right.
That's
right.
good instruction, just good basic instruction. So we've been talking a lot about narratives, even within nonfiction, but is that the only source of information for ethnic studies? Talk some more about that, Keith.
I think narratives are a good starting point for just about any topic, but there are a lot of other sources that you can also use. For example, you could use informational text about a topic. You could use primary source documents. You could use visual images, photographs, or drawings. So there's really a wide range of things you can draw on in teaching ethnic studies. It's just that I think narrative is a good first step, that then once students are understanding and are interested in the topic, you can branch out into other kinds of sources that may be a little bit more challenging.
So I'm glad you brought that up because it reminds us all of the goal of the Common Core State Standards to put more emphasis on informational text, because that's the real world. And if we're preparing kids for the real world, they need to be more familiar with that. There's no reason why we can't introduce this more and more in the elementary grades. And like you said, there's a plethora of resources out there to tie in.
If I get to tell my own personal story here, when
Yes.
one of my granddaughters was in first grade, I was convinced, we were all convinced, that she hated books. She wouldn't have anything to do with them. And then we realized she actually hated stories.
Really?
And she loved informational text. And once we started using more informational text, she was far more interested in books. So even though I think stories are a great starting point, they're not for all kids. And some kids like other kinds of text.
That's very interesting. And you'll see them, if you have kids of your own or grandkids, you know, you'll see them drawn to certain topics, right? The kids will get on I'm only going to read about dinosaurs, right? Remember all that. Let them go.
Yeah.
Let them do that.
This is also why we want that basket or a box of
Yes.
all types of books and information on a topic so they can explore that in depth.
And in different languages.
Yeah,
We
yes.
have a lot of English learners in our California schools. I don't know a school anywhere in California that doesn't have them. So having them in different languages is a powerful tool of getting them involved.
We've talked about integration, and you brought up the Common Core, and having documents and photographs and informational text and narratives when students make a claim and support it with evidence, as we have to in our English language arts and in social studies and in science and in math. That skill, we want to be able to give them the supplies so that they can do those things.
My grandson loves to hear a story. Tell me a story. Well, there's lots of stories. So of course I tell him history stories, right? Because we always talked about history as a story well told, right? So it's a great opportunity for all our kids. So this all sounds well and good, but we know ethnic studies can be very controversial, and especially some of the topics that are introduced. We're seeing this at all levels. So that could likely happen in any classroom. You know, you're reading a story about a certain event or person, child goes home, could be seen as controversial. How do we prepare teachers? What should they do? How can they respond to some of those issues that come up, Keith? Help us with that.
There's no magic formula, but I think there are a few things to keep in mind that make this easier. One is when we're teaching about ethnic studies, we can justify that by simply saying we teach everyone's history. I mean, that may be controversial to some people, but that's easy to defend because it's hard to say you should intentionally leave certain groups out of the curriculum. So just saying we teach everyone's history is one defense. Another one is by focusing on themes like how do people do things for others. That's also hard to argue with. I mean, are there really people who are going to say, no, you should not be teaching students about how you can do things for others? So the way we frame ethnic studies in elementary school in particular, I think can help us avoid some of these issues. But Rebecca, you were also going to say some things about this.
Children come to school with a wide range of knowledge. They hear things. They know what's going on. They see social media. They see the news. When they come in with questions, it's our duty and responsibility to talk to them about it, to share information. When we don't talk about something, it then becomes taboo. And then what does that say? Where are they going to get their information if it's not from someone they trust and in a place that they feel comfortable? So I think a lot can be said about having that affective filter low in your classroom to be able to openly discuss all types of topics and include everybody. That, like Keith said, there's no justification to not be including people in our curriculum, in our story, in our history, reading books about other people. Those are not objectionable items.
I agree with you totally, but we know in many places there's all kinds of efforts to ban certain books and topics. It's a real slippery slope, and often teachers are at the center of that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to remember is that teachers are professionals, and they need to have thought through why they're teaching, what they're teaching, and to be able to articulate that to others. If someone has a well thought out rationale for ethnic studies or for any part of the curriculum, they should be able to explain that to others. Now, they're not always going to convince people, but much better than just saying, I don't know, I thought we were supposed to do this. That's not very convincing.
And I think it's important, I'm sure you'd agree, for teachers to know their community, to know the voices. We want to respect parental voice, community voice, be conscious of that. I've seen teachers send notes home in advance about a topic we're going to study. If you have any questions, come tell me. Once it's explained, I think it prevents some of the knee-jerk responses that we're seeing. We want to respect parents' views on this, of course.
Right. Sending the book titles home ahead is, when people read Pies from Nowhere or see them ahead of time, I think it kind of diffuses a lot of their misconceptions about what ethnic studies is or how it might be utilized in the elementary classroom.
And that's just normal practice in elementary classrooms because we send newsletters home saying what we're going to be working on in reading or math this month. So it would include all the topics.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Just getting in the habit of that. Having them out and available for teachers, for parents and family members to look at.
The transparency.
Transparency. Sounds easy, but we know there's some challenging circumstances out there, even in California communities. So, yes. But yeah, I like what you said, treating teachers as professionals and keeping their administration engaged too and informed what they're doing. That helps them a great deal because they're going to be the first ones getting those phone calls, right?
Right.
So we want to be transparent with all of them and make sure everyone's on the same page. Yes, for sure. All right, so we've had great discussion here. So we just want to summarize quickly. What would you say, each of you, I would love to hear from both of you, is the power of using children's literature to introduce our youngest students to ethnic studies, if you could capture that?
I think most importantly, children see themselves. And they can, in one way or another, they're going to find themselves in one of the stories that we teach. And that connection to school is what's going to keep them in school and keep them motivated and love learning and feel like they're a part of a shared community.
So even seeing someone of the same race or ethnicity is one thing, but maybe the same gender, maybe the same birth order, maybe he has black hair, I have black hair. It could be anything, like you said, connecting to those characters. Keith, some final words?
I think children's literature is one of the best ways of helping students think about the choices we may have to make and the ways that we can live together in an imperfect world. It's an understandable, comprehensible introduction to some very difficult issues. So, for example, in the last book that we want to mention here, the Sugihara story, Passage to Freedom, it's about a Japanese diplomat in Lithuania during World War II. And as the Nazis are pursuing Polish Jews eastward, they come to Sugihara's diplomatic residence and ask him to write visas for them. And he asked his government, can I give visas to all of these refugees? And the government says no. And he asked the government again. He asked them a third time. And the Japanese government each time, because of course they're allies with Germany, and they say, no, you can't write them visas. And he does it anyway. And he's believed to have saved hundreds or thousands of people who were fleeing the Nazis. I mean, this introduces us to some of the tough decisions that we may be forced to make sometime in our life. The very last page of this book, it's written from the perspective of his son. It says, back then, I did not fully understand what the three of them, that is his father, his aunt, and his mother, had done, or why it was important. I do now. So children's literature can introduce students to some very, very important themes, but in a way that makes sense to them.
It's a powerful story. The topic around the Holocaust needs to be introduced in an age-appropriate manner. Not sure I would use this with kindergarten, first graders, but like you said, the power of the story. And it talks in great length of the personal sacrifice and how hard it was for him to go against his own government and the risk for himself and his family. That's huge. How many of us, I'm not so sure, would be willing to do that?
But we may be facing those questions someday.
Sometimes we all face that in some way, shape, or form. Voice, empowerment, identity, understanding, respect, all of those themes come forth in this story and can take you in a lot of different directions. So I think it's a powerful piece for us to end our conversation on. I want to thank you both. This was very enlightening. We're hoping that it's useful for elementary teachers, administrators, community members, parents to really understand we're not just reading stories for stories' point. We're introducing really important issues, topics, and empowerment for young people to go beyond the story, to see themselves in today's story and what they can do in little ways, small ways, big ways to make the world a better place for all of us living in this very diverse community. That's the goal of ethnic studies, and we can start it early with our youngest students. So thank you both again. It's a great conversation.
Thanks.